The crossing guard. It was on a cool October morning when Tim and Betty were walking to school. Just because it was Halloween didn't mean that school was canceled, but it didn't make the day any less exciting. They walked to school together as they did each morning. The topic of conversation turned to the crossing guard. They could see from a distance. The crossing guard raised her hand-held stop sign with her chubby arm and blowing her whistle with that red round face. "You know she lives down the street," Tim said. "Who told you that?" Betty replied, while she kept her eyes peeled to feet as she walked. Beside the fact that they were twins, Betty always questioned Tim when he presented information that seemed wildly inconclusive. "You don't believe me?" Betty kicked a small rock from the sidewalk, back into the planter where it came from. "Sometimes your information gets us in trouble." "That's true," Tim said. "But I heard it from Bobby in my history class. He lives 2 doors down from her." "Does he know her name?" Betty said. "Miss White." "Okay then, I believe you." Betty smiled while she looked down at her steps. "So," Tim said coyly, "how about we trick or treat in her neighborhood and check it out?" "Sure. That would be a good score if everything turns out to be true." "Shh. She's walking back across the street." Tim and Betty were waiting on the corner for Miss White to cross back over. Miss White looked especially round today. Her ashy blonde hair bounced as she hoofed it across the asphalt with her stop sign and blaring whistle. She would always stare at the children with a look of disdain as they walked by into her personal space. Tim and Betty could smell her perfume, a fragrance that was reminiscent of spoiled roses wafted all around. The smell accentuated her wrinkly face and witch-like looks and composure. She took a wildly deep breath and blew into her whistle, red-faced and determined. She trounced back across the street, raising her stop sign, and signaled for Tim and Betty to cross. Tim and Betty smiled as they passed Miss White, knowing soon they'd be trick or treating, mainly focused on the treating. School ended quick enough, and Tim and Betty were in their rooms putting their Halloween costumes on. Tim was a classic Dracula, and Betty was Frankenstein's bride. They emerged from their rooms at the same time, laughed at their new, ghoulish looks. "You look really scary," Tim said. "The gray streaks in your hair look awesome." Betty smiled as evil as she could. "You look classic." "I'll take that as a compliment," Tim said proudly. "Pillowcase?" "Check," Betty said enthusiastically. "Let's tell Bill and Lynn we're leaving." "Great." Tim and Betty exited their house into a perfectly ambient autumn evening. Bill and Lynn have to be the best parents a couple of kids like us could ever have. Betty shook her head in agreement. "They are the best, and we've had a lot of parents." "Just the best," Tim said. "Let's warm up before we get to Miss White's house and get us some candy." They walked up to the first house that had a jack-o'-lantern lit up on the porch and rang the doorbell. The door swung open while Tim and Betty yelled out, "Trick or treat!" A middle-aged man dressed as a pirate thrusted a bowl of candy toward Tim and Betty, holding it at their eye level. Tim and Betty grabbed a handful of candy and placed them in their pillowcases. The man smiled. "So we've got Dracula and—" The middle-aged man's wife walked up from behind. "How cute! Dracula and Frankenstein's bride." The man looked at his wife. "That's it. Frankenstein's bride. Thank you, dear." "Of course, my darling. You 2 kids have a safe night, okay?" Tim and Betty quickly walked away. "Those are 2 strange little kids," the wife said. The man and his wife watched Tim and Betty make it to the sidewalk and walk away. Tim looked over at Betty. "It's a great night tonight." Betty smiled. "I grabbed a couple of chocolate bars out of that bowl." "Me too." There was an increased presence of kids beginning to build up on the sidewalks. More laughter and chatter could be heard from all directions. "So you know where Miss White lives, right?" Betty asked. "Of course I do. She lives on Maple and Syrup. Her house has 2 candy-striped poles on her porch." "Really?" Betty said. "That's what Bobby said. And trust me, Bobby knows." "How far away are we?" "A couple more streets, and we will be there." Tim skipped a little on his feet. "A couple more houses, then we can hit the jackpot." After a few more houses and few more handfuls of chocolate and candies, Tim and Betty stood squarely in front of Miss White's house. The concrete walkway that split her yard in 2 was cracked and ashy, with the occasional red and orange autumn leaf lightly touching its surface. "Bobby was right about the candy-striped columns," Betty said. "I told you Bobby was a good source." Betty threw her candy-filled pillowcase over her shoulder. All the tiny candy wrappers jilted, and then almost instantly quieted down. "Are you ready?" "Not only am I ready, I'm very excited," Tim said. "Come on, let's go." The street was quiet in front of Miss White's house. It seemed as if all the kids in the neighborhood had vanished at once. The leaves crunched under Tim and Betty's feet as they made their way to the front door. "You knock," Betty said. Tim smiled and knocked on the door firmly, but not too hard. "Do you think she heard the knock?" Betty asked. "Yeah, just give her a minute." They heard a rummaging from behind the door, and it suddenly creaked open. "I finally got some trick-or-treaters," Miss White said. "How nice. It seems like the children aren't walking down my street this year." Miss White pushed out a bowl of candies. Tim looked over Miss White's shoulder and saw a display of overly large cakes and pies sitting on the counter in her kitchen. The pies were golden brown on the edges, while the cakes looked fluffy and moist. "Can we have some of those?" Tim said. "I'm sorry, those are for someone else." "But they look so tasty." Miss White glared at Tim with cold eyes. "Sure, why not?" Her calloused scowl turned into a jovial smile. "Won't you come in, both of you?" "Thank you," Tim and Betty said as they stepped into the house. Miss White took a long scan of the neighborhood before she closed the door and locked it. Miss White walked into the kitchen. "Would you like some lemonade or soda? It is Halloween." Betty smiled. "I would love a lemonade." "And you little man." Tim looked at Betty playfully. "I'll have a lemonade too." "Give me a minute or 2, and I'll get you a couple of glasses. I'll be right back." Miss White left the kitchen and walked to a different area of the house and out of view. "So what do you think?" Tim said. "Your friend was right," Betty pointed. "Look at the size of that oven. I mean, the entire room when you first walk into this house is a kitchen." Tim licked his lips. "Look at the size of those pies." "That's pretty much a dead giveaway," Betty said. Miss White walked into the kitchen area with a tray, and on top of the tray was a pitcher of lemonade and 2 small glasses filled with ice. She set the tray down on the table next to the pies and cakes. "That looks refreshing," Betty said with a smile. "Thank you. Allow me to pour you 2 a glass." Miss White handled the pitcher with an ease of the wrist and poured the glasses full. "Come," she said, "and have a glass." Tim winked at Betty and raised his glass. "Here's to the best Halloween in the last 7 years." Tim clinked his glass to Betty's, and they drank up. Tim set his glass down next to the pitcher. "I don't feel so good," he said. "I don't feel good either," Betty added as she felt her forehead. Tim closed his eyes and fell to the floor. Betty did the same and laid down right next to Tim. Miss White stared at Tim and Betty with apprehension. She cautiously tiptoed her way over to the children and nudged Tim with her foot. He didn't move. "That was really fast," Miss White said under her breath. "The others took at least 10 minutes, but you two, what? Less than a minute." Miss White grabbed each one of Tim's arms and slowly dragged him over to the oven. "I'll go ahead and turn the oven on first." Miss White turned on the gas, and a bar of flames lit up the inside of the oven. She walked to Betty and stooped down, giving Betty's pretty girlish face a look over. "I wish I still had my youth," she whispered while she lightly stroked Betty's cheek. Miss White stood up quickly with a stern resolve. "I may not be as young as I had wished to be, but I will regain a lot of my youth in, let's say, 0.45 minutes at 410 degrees. Miss White laughed. The heat from the oven began to warm up the kitchen, while a tinge of burnt bread began to linger gently in the air. Miss White whistled as she sharpened her meat knife. The tinge of the metal blade rubbed on a sharpening stone rattled in the quietude of the air. Fresh meat, Miss White sang. "Fresh children meat." She laughed. She sat the knife down on the table and walked to the refrigerator, opening the door with a jovial demeanor. "Good thing I have a lot of extra pie dough." Miss White pulled out a huge ball of kneaded dough from the fridge and carried it with both arms to the kitchen table and plopped it down. "Now a couple of pie pans." She turned around and stooped under the cabinets and found two thin aluminum pie pans, big enough to hold Tim and Betty in each one. The dough was cold, but as she tamped it down in the pie pans, it loosened up and became more pliable. The pie pans were ready for their filling. Miss White licked her lips. "Now it's time for the filling." She grabbed her knife and knelt down next to Tim. "Don't worry, little one. This won't hurt a bit." Miss White raised the knife. "How forgetful of me," she said. "I almost forgot the blood essence." Miss White walked out of the kitchen and came back in moments later with a needle syringe. She sat it down on the floor and raised her sharpened knife once more and prepared to slice off Tim's right ear first. The blade of the knife was razor sharp and reflected the flames of the oven on the cold steel. She grabbed Tim's ear with her right hand, bent it slightly as she lowered the blade to lop off his ear. Tim's eyes opened wide as his Dracula makeup creased in wrinkles as he smiled. "Gotcha!" Miss White's eyes and mouth went agape as she screamed in fright. Tim laughed and grabbed Miss White's hand, which was gripping the knife tightly. "I don't think so," Miss White said, and in a split second her face turned green and her eyes bulged from the sockets. That once chubby, deceivingly fake smile that she gave all the kids as they walked to school turned green, thin and scornful. Her nose grew out and hooked down to her thin upper lip, and her breath smelled like rotting flesh as it faintly brushed across Tim's nostrils. Tim was abhorred at the smell and the sight of her face. Tim struggled. Miss White had a size advantage, and they fought for control of the knife. "I'm going to enjoy devouring you and absorbing your essence," Miss White blurted out under her breath. She reinforced the knife with two hands and used her body weight to lunge the knife closer to Tim's eye. The tip of the blade was a breath away from Tim's cornea when he looked away from Miss White's witchy face and smiled. "You're happy to die," Miss White shouted. A bludgeoning blow to the side of Miss White's head knocked her to the ground. She released the knife from her grip, and Tim moved his head just in time for the knife to stick upright into the floor. Miss White was knocked out cold and laid face down and motionless. "That was close," Tim said. Betty was standing in place holding a rolling pin in her hand. "Your friend was right." "I told you." Tim pulled the knife out of the floor. "I don't know why you don't believe me." "You know it's not that. The thing is, we are eventually going to have to grow up. Soon there will be no more witches to drink from." Well, I reserve the right to stay positive. I'm just thinking of the future, Betty said. Well, stop that, and just try thinking of the now, okay? Give me a break. As long as there is evil in the world, there will always be another witch. Tim checked Miss White's pulse. Besides, after we drink her juice, we'll be covered for another 7 years. Betty picked up the needle syringe. If you say so. We've been able to stay children for what? Over 1,000 years. I think that's pretty good. And remember what we always say. Betty smiled reluctantly. I know. Children are the sun, and children are the light. They said out loud in unison. Betty jammed the needle into the base of Miss White's neck and pulled back on the plunger. It filled with a yellowish liquid that looked thick and viscous. Betty pulled the syringe out of Miss White's neck, and a small blood drop grew from her green skin. That looks good. It's really yellow, Tim said. I have to admit I was surprised that she was a green witch. Me too. Tim sat 2 small cups on the counter. Fill her up. Tim continued to talk while Betty filled the cups. She must eat a lot of children and drink a lot of essence. Betty shook her head in agreement. How long has it been since we've seen a green witch anyway? Tim said. 1881, New Orleans. What was her name? Betty finished filling the cups. Marie Laveau. That's right. Good memory, Tim said. We got 21 years from her juice. Seeing Miss White's juice makes me think we might get another 20 years from her. We got lucky, Betty said. She handed one of the cups to Tim. I'm serious, Tim. I often wonder what it would be like to be a grown-up. Do you want to die? Tim said bluntly. I know Tim, Betty shouted. We've been children for so long. Betty calmed down and gave up on the conversation. Tim raised his glass to Betty. Drink up. Tim closed his eyes and tilted the cup of juice into his mouth. Hey, that tasted sweeter than I expected. A little like honey. Betty shook her head, and her bride of Frankenstein hair buns moved side to side. Yeah. Tim looked at his watch. That was close, he said. It's almost midnight. 1 minute to midnight to be exact. Tim could tell that Betty wasn't her usual self. You don't seem happy today, Betty. What's going on? Tim knelt down to check Miss White's pulse. Her pulse is fading. He's almost dead. Concerned, Tim looked at Betty. Would you snap out of it, please? Betty? Betty smiled at Tim. Her face looked frozen, and she just stared at him with vacant eyes. Betty, Tim whispered. His heart knotted in his chest. Betty? Tim unknowingly stepped back away from Betty. She didn't move, just smiled and stared, emotionless. Tim was horrified as he watched Betty's face begin to change, and her stature start to grow. What did you do? Tim yelled. Tim looked around and saw a small puddle of Miss White's juice on the floor. You didn't drink it. Betty didn't move. Tim watched with his mouth wide open as Betty slowly aged. Her arms and legs sprouted to length along with her body. Her once child-full body was now the body of a grown adult woman. Betty blinked slowly and smiled maturely. Her countenance was full of grace and beauty, woman-like and sultry. Tim could hardly recognize her. He was horrified that this grown woman who stood in front of him was once his little twin sister, Betty. Her dominant identifiable features were there, like the shape of her eyes and the contours of her face. Betty, Tim groveled, why did you do that? Betty's voice was silky, mature, and deeper than her childish way that she used to speak. I told you I wanted to know what it was like to be a grown-up, Betty said. I never thought you would do something like this without telling me. Tim was visibly shaken and disturbed. We have to change you back. Betty smiled. I don't want to. I feel great. Look how tall I am. I'm an adult. Betty twirled herself around with her arms in the air. She stopped spinning and caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror that was hanging on the nearby wall. She stared into her own eyes and walked closer to the mirror, keeping a lock on her gaze. She stopped inches from the mirror and looked into the corneas of her own soul. She recognized her eyes and followed the fine-lined wrinkles around with her fingers. She did not recognize herself at all. She suddenly regretted what she had done. Her heart raced, and her eyes welled up with tears. "Is there a way that I can reverse this?" she asked. Tim was kneeling next to Miss White, trying to extract more juice from her brain. Miss White's green skin started to tighten and shrink rapidly. Her hands, starting with the fingertips, began to roll up over themselves and tighten to her shoulders, followed by her toes, up to her body. All of Miss White's appendages were tightly wound, shriveled, and close to her body. A loud pop blew into the air, and her green face cracked in an instant. Her eyeballs melted into vacant eye sockets and evaporated into dust. Betty stood speechless and tall. "First time for everything," Tim said. "What does that mean?" Betty asked. Tim felt around Miss White's body and noticed that all of her skin and organs had devolved into what appeared and felt like sawdust. He felt around her shirt and grabbed a handful of the matter. He held the particles from her body and let them sift through his fingers, and it fell like heavy granules of yellowish snow. "I have no idea what just happened, but I did manage to get a little more juice." Tim smiled, and he held up the syringe. It was a little more than a quarter full. "Isn't it too late to drink the juice? Look at what I've done. If I drink it, I'll just be stuck as this older version of myself. What have I done?" Betty said in distraught. Tim stood up and was just about waist-high to Betty. "How about instead of drinking the juice, I inject it straight into your brain?" Betty's tears went dry. "Do you think it could work?" "It's worth a try. Kneel down." Betty knelt down and pulled her hair to the side so that Tim could get a good view of her lower skull. "Wait," Betty said. "What if I am stuck like this forever?" she asked. "I guess you'll have to be my new mother." Tim paused. "Or I could let my body grow old too, but that could be 20 years from now. We won't know until we see the mark." 20 years does go fast," Betty said. Tim smiled crookedly. "I was mad at first, but there are some good sides to you being an adult. Look how tall you are." Betty and Tim chuckled to themselves. Betty held up her arms and flexed. "Look at me. I am a big, strong woman." Betty poked and prodded Tim's stomach, as if she was still a child at heart. "Go ahead. Give me the juice. I want to be a kid again. Being an adult is already not fun." The smile left her face. "Okay, this might hurt a little." Tim lifted the syringe and gently poked the needle into the back of Betty's neck and straight into her brain. He pressed the liquid in, and Betty winced. "How do you feel?" Tim asked. "I don't feel anything." Tim sat the syringe down on the countertop next to the giant pies. "It probably takes a few minutes," he said. "Wait a minute." Betty felt faint and leaned against the countertop. "I'm feeling dizzy. I think I'm changing back." Tim watched as Betty's face began to subtly change. "Betty, look." Tim pointed to Betty's face. She turned to look at herself in the mirror. "What's happening?" Betty was aghast as she watched her skin turn to an emerald green. "What did you do?" she cried out as she turned around, wide-eyed and desperate. Tim backed away from Betty in horror. Her nose grew in prominence, and her eyebrows thickened like black smears above her eyes. "What's become of me?" she cackled. "Tim, where are you going?" Tim ran toward the front door, and he turned the knob, but the door didn't open. He looked up and saw a dead bolt at the top of the door frame. He looked back toward the kitchen and saw Betty stumbling toward him with a new-founded hump on her back and a hitch in her step. Tim jumped in an attempt to somehow twist the knob on the deadbolt, but he couldn't muster the strength with his little fingers. "Tim, don't leave me," Betty groveled. Her feet pounded the ground and slid across the floor in non-rhythmic intervals. Tim continued to try and unbolt the lock. He looked up at the lock frantically and back at Betty charging him. He gathered his strength and gave a final jump, and the deadbolt unlocked. He reached for the doorknob and pulled the door open to the air of a past Halloween night. He stepped out and immediately felt a hard tug from Betty grabbing him by his shirt. "Not so fast," she crooned. Betty put her face inches from Tim's face, and he shouted in fright. Betty was transformed to a witch that looked identical to a more youthful Miss White. "Thank you for bringing me back to life. I love my new younger body. Youth is always wasted on the young." Betty?" Tim said. "Yes, Timmy, I'm listening. We are all listening," Betty said. "Betty would never hurt me." "Of course not. I won't hurt you, little Timmy, but I can't guarantee I won't be eating you." Betty picked Tim up off of the ground. "First, we have to fatten you up." Betty walked over to the oven, pulling Tim by his arm, and flipped a light switch. A secret wall moved and revealed a cage. She opened it with jarring movements and shoved Tim inside. "See you tomorrow afternoon, Timmy. First thing in the morning, I'm going to see about a job opening for a crossing guard." A loud knock banged on the door. Betty shuffled slowly and stopped to look out of the peephole. "Halloween is over," she whispered as she opened the door. "Do I know you?" "My name is Bobby. I live a few doors down." "Would you like a sweet treat?" Betty asked.